Oh, Nelson said he cannot hear me. Can you guys hear me?
I can.
Okay,
Yes.
that's, I
Yes.
think, the side. Maybe you should restart your system or just leave and join us back.
Apart
All
from
right.
that, there's this thing that Zoom does that if you cannot hear somebody or you have issues, when you click on the mic, it gives you a list of options to pick from the speaker you want to
Okay,
use.
from the speaker. Okay, yeah, that's
Yes.
true. All right. Let me see those are in class. Who is Mimi? Can you identify yourself, please? Mimi. M-I-M-E. Who is that? Sorry, if I don't know you, I have to drop you.
Good evening. My name is Mercy.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
I just want to identify those that are in class. Okay. All right. So today we are continuing with the cloud compute in the cloud. We started with compute EC2, which is Amazon compute service, which we normally use for servers in the cloud. So when you spin up a server in the cloud, I believe that you guys can see me as well. Okay, yeah. So when you spin up a server in the cloud and you deploy your resources in that particular server, one issue that might occur is that the server might develop a fault, and as a result of that, it might stop working. And another issue is that maybe you deploy a server for like a server that can handle workload for like 12 or 20 customers, and accidentally or luckily your customer base increased from 20 to like 100. So in that case, you will need to spin up more instance that can handle the workload that the customers, the traffic that the customer are sending. So as a result of this, you might want to spin up more servers. But as we all know that when you work in cloud, the servers is not directly in your own office or in a place that you can easily go to. So there might be a case that when you want to spin up the server, or maybe when the traffic increase, you are not available as at that time to quickly jump in and spin up a new server. So there are multiple means of automating that process of spinning up a new server when you are not there. You want your infrastructure, you want your setup to respond to different workload. So because of this, we have a service in the AWS that called AutoScaling. So to our topic today, we are going to be looking at scaling. We're going to start from looking at what is scalability. That means, I think we started talking about this the other time, but I'll just take a little recap on it. So when we talk about scalability, it's increasing in your I won't say infrastructure, just increasing in your workload might increase your might require the need for your resources to increase as well. Just look at this set of people. When they access your website, or when you create your website, this website is meant, maybe you created it for just 20 people, and this website is actually being hosted on a server that looks like this. Maybe the server is just two core CPU with 500 gigabytes and 16 gig RAM, which you know that, okay, because you are a startup, your customer base, this should be enough for your customers, which they are, maybe you projected like, okay, you won't have more than 20 customers for the time being. Then as a result of that, something happens. and the customer base increased from 20 to like 200. And once those customers increase from 20 to 200, and they want to access your server, remember, the same server will still be serving those people. So because this increase in numbers of users sending traffic at the same time, then the workload on this server will be too much. The workload on this server will be too much, and guess what? It might break down. So in order for that not to happen, you need to increase the capacity of this server. You need to increase the capacity of this server. So there are multiple ways of increasing the capacity of the server. One, you might change some of the hardware, like the CPU. Now you might have to increase the CPU from 2 core to something like this, like 18 cores. Please, if you're not talking to the class, can you mute yourself? So you might have to increase the server CPU, the server CPU from 2 core to 18 cores. And you might also have to increase by changing the current hard drive from 500 gig to like 4 terabytes. And you might also increase the RAM. But when you are doing this, there is limit to there is limit to how far you can go, because if you keep changing the hardware, keep changing each component of the hardware, then it will come to a state that you will not be able to change it again. So this process of changing the hardware and replacing it with another one is what we call scale up. You scale up the system, and it's also what we refer to as vertical scaling. So there are 2 types of scalability. We have the horizontal and we have the vertical scaling. The horizontal scaling is when you have a server and the workload increase. So instead of you going to that server and change some parts from that server, maybe you're changing it from 2 core CPU to like 16 core CPU, you might just have to introduce another server entirely. Then when the workload increases again, then you introduce another server. And this way, you are only provision the server when the demand or when the workload demands. So when the workload reduces, maybe as a result of some customer, maybe it's because it's getting late, so people are closing for the day, so people don't really, there are fewer people on your website, so you don't need 3 servers again. Maybe, okay, from 200, they are reduced to 150, then you need to go there and remove 1 server. Then if that 150 again reduce back to the normal size of customer that you normally have, like the average customer, maybe, then you might have to go there and reduce the server to 1 again. So this process of adding servers, extra servers, and removing extra servers is called the horizontal scaling, or you call it scale out or scaling. Scale out is when you are adding more server. Scaling is when you are reducing unused servers. Then the second one, which I have explained earlier, is the vertical scaling. And that is the process that you keep adding hardware to existing servers. You remove a particular hardware, you add a new one to it, but you are modifying the same server. That is vertical. That is when something is just growing. So that is vertical scaling, something like this. You go from small server, then you change some components and increase the server. This is scale up or scale down. And when the components or the number of users has reduced, then you can go back and remove the component that you introduce and put a smaller component back. So this process is vertical scaling. So please don't forget there are 2 types of scaling: vertical scaling or horizontal scaling. This always come out a lot in an interview. Then there are AWS services. AWS provide service for auto-scaling. They provide service for scaling so that you don't have to manually do this process of going there, adding servers, or adding or removing components from a particular server. So the service that AWS provide for this task is called auto-scaling. So with auto-scaling, it helps you to have the correct number of EC2 instances available to handle your workload. Tina, your question?
No, just technically speaking, on that scalability. So at what point in time do we, if I understand what you explain now, that means if there is maybe like an high demand, that's when we use the horizontal scaling. And if the system is slow, that's when we use the vertical scaling. Am I right if we want to look at it in technical aspects, or I'm wrong?
No. So you don't look at that when there is high demand or when the system is slow. So when we talk about scalability, it talks about making sure that you have available number of resources to handle your workload. When a server is low, that does not really mean that your workload increases. It might just be as a result of performance issue. Maybe the developers that write your code that is serving that application, they do not write proper coding, or they do not they have unnecessary devices plugged to your servers, or it's on slow of a server might happen in different way. But when we're talking about scaling out and scaling in, you are looking in terms of workload. When your workload increase, you want to make sure that you have enough resources to handle those workload. If you have asked questions such as, okay, which of them, like if you're asked, like I should give like use cases when to use a particular one, then I will say that vertical scaling is more suitable when you are dealing with database, because you don't want to have your data in different server and expect clients to be querying them from different server, because a user particular data might be in one server and the another data might be in second server. So doing the indexing might be complex somehow. But when you have your data in one server, it's easy to query. Then when we're talking about the horizontal scaling, that is more useful when you're talking about handling user requests, like sending traffic of sending web services to a customers in terms of servers. So, but that question, I won't match that questions to scaling.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay.
Yeah, I won't link them together. Yeah. That actually makes sense. So AWS have auto-scaling. The auto-scaling, it helps you to automate that process of increasing your resources to handle the workload instead of you manually doing it yourself. And I'm not saying that because you are on the cloud, you still can't do manual scaling. Even with auto scaling, there are still parts there are different type of scaling policies on auto scaling. Like one, you might go there manually and manually trigger the auto scaling to respond to requests. That will still be categorized as manual scaling. And there are also other scaling that you have to set an automation, like, okay, on so dates, increase the number of resources that I have. Maybe because you have looked at the pattern of workload, maybe you notice that, okay, every Monday we don't used to have sales because people are just getting back to office, but every Friday we used to have a lot of sales. then you might configure the auto-scaling and set a policy that every Friday, increase the server to like 4 servers, and on Monday, just drop the server back to 1. So that can still happen, and we're still going to get there. So with auto-scaling, you can automatically add or remove Amazon EC2 instances in response to changing applications demand. And you can also automatically scale your instance in or out, or in and out as needed. So with this, you can maintain consistent application availability, meaning that your user at any point in time, how many numbers of users that comes in to check your application, your application is always responding to traffic. So let's look at the advantage of auto-scaling. When we look at the advantages of auto-scaling, the first thing that comes to mind is that it helps you to make sure that your application is always responding to traffic. Because if 10 people are on your website, then your website is there. If 10 people increase to 100 people, the auto-scaling is listening to every request. And if there is no enough resources, it's spinning up multiple resources. Then apart from the better fault tolerance, that I explained is called fault tolerance. And this is another concept in the cloud that you need to get familiar with. Fault tolerance, meaning that your application can withstand any kind of fault, either natural disaster or manual human-made disaster. Your application should be able to respond to any kind of fault. Then the second one is ensure highly availability of your application. This can be indirectly, most of the time people use them interchangeably because they actually sound the same, or if you look at it in the long run or in a different angle, they actually mean the same. But they are two different things. Your applications is always available, responding to traffic. For instance, now, if you have your application, maybe you have an application in USC 1A, maybe one of the availability zones that we discussed. And if something happens to that availability zone, then if you have your resources also in different availability zone, then the one in the other availability zone will be responding to traffic. But now, if you configure the auto-scaling to respond to that kind of situation, then the one issue that you might encounter is that the auto-scaling might scale up the server, but scale it in the same server, in the same availability zone that currently have a working server. So you have availability zone A and availability zone B. A has a server that is down and B has a server that is actively working. If you don't configure your auto-scaling properly, the auto-scaling might scale up because one of the server is down, but instead of putting that server in the availability zone where the availability zone that do not have any server, then it might send it to the one that currently have a server that is working. So if you configure it very well, then the the auto-scaling can take note of that instance. It's like, okay, this availability zone does not have any server, why this one has. So when it's spinning up a new server, it will move it to availability zone that do not have any server, so it can balance the availability zone and your application can be available at every point in time. But if you if you spin up a new server and spin it up in the availability zone that already have is your meeting will end. Oh, damn it. I forgot to, give me 5 minutes. I forgot to pay for this because I initially wanted to cancel it when I was using it for demo. Just give me some minutes. I'll clear this. I'll pause the video. It's showing me that the Zoom will soon off. Okay, it's resolved. Thanks for that. Oh, I wanted to stop the recording and I stopped the sharing. I hope you guys can see my screen now.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was not intending to stop my sharing. I wanted to stop the recording, but that is fine. All right, let me see the screen again. Okay, so the third one is better cost management, because now that you are using AutoScaling, when you have a lot of customers that is accessing your application, then you need a lot of server, fine, because you use money to look for money, right? So when you have fewer customers and you don't want, when you have fewer customers using your application, you don't want to have multiple servers serving very few customers. So instead of having a lot of server serving few customers, the AutoScaling will help you to drop that servers down to the normal that is enough to serve the current users. So with that, it helps you to save a lot of money, which means that you only pay for the servers that is good enough to serve your the customer that are accessing your applications. So when you are creating your AutoScaling group, one thing that should come to your mind is that, okay, or one question that should be ringing in your mind now is, this AutoScaling group that helps you to spin up a server, how do the AutoScaling group know the configuration of the server that it should spin up? Because it's an automation, and so anything that is machine or computer, you pass in an input and it give you an output. So if I instruct an AutoScaling group to spin up a server when something happens in my account, then does that mean it will just go ahead and spin up any server that it wants? Or how does it go about it and spin up the exact server that I want it to spin up? And also, the question is, how, when it spin up the new server, so where does it get the application that it puts on the new server so that it can serve that same applications to the current customer? Or does it just spin up a server that does not have any application running on it? So when you configure your AutoScaling, there is a service or a template that you also have to configure, and that is called the launch configuration. So this launch configuration, that is where you put all the parameters that the AutoScaling will use to spin up that new server. And it's also the same thing, the same configuration, the same template that you will put the code of, the operating systems, let me call it that way, the operating systems that the server will use to spin up the new, that the AutoScaling will use to spin up the new server. So the AutoScaling is not just doing things on its own. It has to follow whatever you put in the configuration file. So this configuration file is what AWS refers to as launch configuration. But AWS is gradually shifting away from this launch configuration because it does not include a lot of informations, or it has limited informations. So they have another one called launch template. So if you go to AWS EC2 now, what you will see is launch template, and you may not find the launch configuration there. So it is this launch template you are going to put all the parameters of that the AutoScaling will use to spin up a new server for you. And in this same launch templates, that is where you also specify the availability zones, whether you want the AutoScaling group to use the exact availability zone, or you just want it to pick a random one. So whatever information you want to pass to the AutoScaling group that the AutoScaling group will be using, you have to put it in the launch template. And if you go to the launch template, you're going to see it under EC2. 1 second, let me quickly log in. I'm not configuring launch AutoScaling. I just want to show you where you will find it. All configuration, we are going to move majority of our configuration to when we start secure solution architect. This is just getting familiar with the services that AWS have. So we're still talking about EC2. So when you go to this is the AutoScaling group. This is where you configure the AutoScaling group, but we are not configuring it today. But up here, if you scroll up somewhere around there, you will see the launch template. Here is the launch template here. And the launch template it looks exactly as you are creating an EC2. But instead of creating EC2, you are only providing information that the AutoScaling group or any automation tools that can create an EC2 for you, what template they should use. So here, you can pull the launch template name, you pull the version, but if you scroll down, you can see this is like you are configuring an EC2 just like the one we did the other day. The application, which is the operating system, you have to select the instance type, you have to select the key, you have to set up the networking, the storage, and the resources. And also, remember, the other day we also have advanced. And this is exactly as if you are configuring your own EC2, but we are not configuring EC2. We are only providing information that the AutoScaling group will use. So back to our presentation. So let's look at the scaling limits. When you tell AutoScaling to scale up, to scale your server when there is need, then there are also other things that you have to tell the AutoScaling apart from providing the AutoScaling information through the launch template. You also have to let the AutoScaling know how many resources it can create for you. Because if you don't specify, let's say assuming you don't have a means of specifying, then what happens if somebody is trying to attack your website and they are sending a lot of traffic, which we call distributed denial of service in cybersecurity. When somebody sends a lot of traffic to your website as a result of attacker, maybe they are using a bot, like a robot or a bot, we call it a bot. They are using a bot like an automation to send a lot of traffic that they might gain access to thousands of computers. They hack different computers and they are controlling all those hacked computers and they are using it to access your website. So what they are indirectly doing, if they are using that thousands of websites to access your website, is that they just want to bring your website down. And immediately they send that huge number of traffic to your website. Then because your website is only, the server that is hosting your website is only meant to respond to attend to maybe 20 computer, which is customer at a time, then now that 1,000 people are coming to where can only fit 20 people, then the server that is hosting your website is going to crash. So immediately that server goes down, the auto-scaling is going to dictate and is going to start spinning up extra server to accommodate those requests. So if there is no way for you to specify the maximum that the auto-scaling can create, then it's going to just continue creating more servers for you. And at the end of the day, then what you are trying to protect will not make sense, because your website, maybe you don't have a lot of information on your website, you are just a startup, you are just starting up, there's not a lot of things there. And just imagine the auto-scaling group has to create almost 600 servers just to respond to 1,000 requests. That is going to be a lot of loss for you. So there is a way you can limit what the auto-scaling can create. So the first scaling limit is what we call desired capacity. When you create an auto-scaling group for the first time, this is what auto-scaling will spin up for you. Whatever you specify under the desired capacity, the auto-scaling will spin up that for you. For instance, if I configure an auto-scaling now, then I tell the auto-scaling group that my desired capacity is 3, then it's going to immediately create that 3 for me. So you should be very, very mindful when you are creating your auto-scaling group, because let's say the total number of instances that you want in your environment is 3, and you already configured that 3 before you even know anything about auto-scaling. You already configured that 3, those 3 are working fine. Then your manager now call you like, hey, what's happened if one of these servers go down? Does that mean that our service will be unavailable? Then you tell your manager that, oh, don't worry, I can handle this. We have auto-scaling. Then you just go there and configure auto-scaling. If you specify the desired capacity to be 3, then guess what? That means you are adding 3 servers to the already 3 that you have. So making 6, which is not what you actually want to do. Because what you actually want to do is you want to have maximum of 3 servers running at the same time. But because you are just configuring auto-scaling after you already set up your environment, then the auto-scaling is going to add extra 3 to it. So you need to be mindful of this when you are creating an auto-scaling group. So the second one is, I think I've explained all of this, the desired capacity, that is the initial capacity of the auto-scaling group at the time of creation. An auto-scaling group starts by launching the number of instances that are specified for the desired capacity. And the next one is what we call the minimum capacity. The minimum capacity, that is the lower when the auto-scaling group is scaling in or reducing servers that he has created, or the server that is currently running, maybe as a result of reduced workload. Then this is the limit or the maximum that the auto-scaling can reduce your server to. So currently, let's say you have 4 servers currently running in your environment, and because of those servers, and people are not using the resources again, then the auto-scaling notice that, okay, the workload has reduced, and maybe 3 of the 4 servers are not responding to any traffic. They are just sitting down there. The only one that is responding to traffic is just 1. Then the auto-scaling will now start reducing the server. So if you don't specify the minimum that the auto-scaling can go, if nobody is on your server, then the auto-scaling will want to terminate the entire server. So you have to specify that the auto-scaling group should leave at least 1 server that will be running. Otherwise, we want to terminate all, but you can set that using the minimum capacity. And the minimum capacity represents the minimum group size in the auto-scaling group. So that is the minimum capacity, the minimum server that the auto-scaling group can reduce your server to. And you cannot decrease the group desired capacity below that of the minimum capacity. So if you set the desired capacity to 2, and you set the minimum to 1, by the time the auto-scaling group is scaling back, it cannot scale below that 1. So the next one and the last one is the maximum capacity. The maximum capacity represents the maximum group size. That is the highest that auto-scaling can go. If you like, let 10 million people be or come to your site at the same time, it can't go more than 5 if you specify maximum of 5. So those are the 3 scaling limits that you should be aware of. So there are different scaling group, different type of scaling that we have. You can scale manually. As I said earlier, you can scale your auto-scaling group, or you can modify your auto-scaling group manually. When we say manually, that is when you have an auto-scaling group running already. Then you go to the auto-scaling group, you change the minimum, or you change the maximum, or you change the desired when the auto-scaling group is already working. Then that's what we refer to as the manual scaling. So the manual scaling, that is when you manually update the desired capacity of the auto-scaling group, or you manually update the instance that are attached to the auto-scaling group, such as the instance type. For instance, maybe when you configure the launch templates, you specify that the auto-scaling group should only launch T2 micro. Then because your requirement has changed, then you go there and you tell the auto-scaling group, you manually change it that instead of running T2 micro, you can now start running something like IEN or I3EN.12s large. So that is all categorized as manual scaling. Then the other type of scaling that we have, which I already explained initially, is called predictive scaling. When we talk about predictive scaling, that is when you perform an automation as a function of date. Performed automatically. That is when your scaling happens as a function of date or a time. This is, you forecast like, okay, on so date, there is Chiefs football are playing in Kansas on Sunday next week. Then you might say, oh, there's going to be a lot of activities in the area. Then you want your server to increase. Maybe you're selling e-commerce or something, and people might want to buy the club jersey and things like that. Or you specify like, okay, on Monday, every Friday, your site is always selling because people are getting ready for the weekend and they're buying a lot of things. Then you might say, okay, make sure that my server, telling the auto-scaling group or configuring it to increase your server on a particular date. These are very used when you use a predictable schedule to control your auto-scaling group. And when we talk about the use case, so for you to use the auto-scaling, the predictive auto-scaling, that means you must have known the exact increase or decrease in number of instances in your group. That is. So the second one, the next one is the dynamic scaling, and this is the most common in the cloud, because you don't know what might happen. You just want to set an auto-scaling group, and it is now the auto-scaling group that will determine, okay, when to scale or when to scale in or when to scale out. This is called the dynamic. The scale based on demand. I said, if you are not talking to the class, can you just mute yourself, Chima and Joy? I muted you guys already. So dynamic, we have the dynamic scaling. That is, it responds to increase or decrease in demand. So you don't actually know what is going to happen. Then you just set the auto-scaling group, and the auto-scaling group respond to demand. And use of scaling policy that dynamically resize your auto-scaling groups to meet changes of changes in demand. So that's just the use case. Then there is another one, which is the third one. We call it proactive scaling. When we talk about proactive scaling, this is when you combine the dynamic and predictive together. For instance, let me explain the predictive scaling. You predict, or you can predict, that on Monday, there is going to be workers will start resuming back to work. So there will be activities on your website. So you set the auto-scaling group to spin up 2 different servers. Maybe over the weekend, you only have 1 server, just listening to any request that might come in. Then on Monday, because you already know that that is when workers will resume and there is going to be activities on your website. So you configure the auto-scaling group to scale up on Monday morning, exactly 7 a.m. when workers are resuming, to scale up. So the auto-scaling group will scale up exactly 7 a.m., knowing that, okay, this is when workers will start coming on board. Then the dynamic is when you don't know, you just tell the auto-scaling group to scale up, and if there is any changes in activities. Then the proactive now combines both. You already know that on Monday there is activities that because workers are resuming back to work. Then instead of waiting till that Monday before you spin up, or before the auto-scaling group scale up to that number of servers that you specify, you might have to scale up before that Monday to be proactive, so that you don't know what might happen. You just want to make sure that everything is ready before that Monday. So instead of spinning up like 7 a.m. on that day, you might have to do it like a night before that 7 a.m. so that everything is already settled and not happening when the workers are already at the office. So that is proactive scaling. It combines both the dynamic and the predictive scaling together. So when we talk about auto scaling, it's a lot of companies uses auto scaling, but you have to be very, very careful at times when you are configuring auto scaling, because apart from the resources that it added to your workload, you also have to configure, you also have to be mindful of the price. As a solution architect, when you get there, because we are still going to do auto scaling, you need to be mindful of the cost whenever you are configuring any resources. You don't just configure resources, and before you configure resources, you have to look at the cost implication too, and how that auto scaling will affect other resources. So though I put a demo here, I will just quickly show you the interface of auto scaling. I'm not configuring it because we're still going to do the same thing, but in a more in-depth when we get to solution architect. So for you to configure the auto scaling, just go to EC2. You can search for the EC2 here, like EC2. But if you already bookmark it or favorite it, you can click on it anywhere. If you don't know how I add all these services here, so just search for a particular service that you want here. Let me say I want to search for data lake. This is data lake here. It's not showing yet, sorry. So I can search for data lake here. Then I will now click any of these. Where is my data lake? Okay, I'm not seeing data lake. Then let me just do security lake. So this asterisk, if you check it, then it will automatically add that service up here. It will pin the service up here. So when you need it, you don't have to go and search again. So for the auto-scaling group, just scroll down. Once you are already in your EC2 page, when you scroll down, it's going to be here, auto-scaling group. And it's very easy to create, just specify creating an auto-scaling group. Then you give it a name. The launch template, this is where you have to pass the launch template, but you must create the launch template first before you come here. Otherwise, you won't have anything to pick. So if you're already here and you have not created the launch template, then you click here to create the launch template. And once you specify the launch template, then just continue clicking on next. But you won't allow me to click on next if I don't specify a launch template. So I'm not intent of configuring this because still going to do it in solution architect. Your main objective and the main takeaway on this solution, cloud practitioner, is just to know a particular service and what that service is meant for. Any question on auto-scaling? Okay, if there is no question on auto-scaling, I'm going to stop